Hello there, and welcome back to my workshop. This is Tool Tote show number 2. Last time I prepped my boards, flattened them, and got them to the width I needed them to be and thickness planed them. So they're in good shape there. While I was away, or while you were away, I cut these to length. You see it here. And I also put the required angles on the ends. It's 26.5 degrees. And also the required bevel on the end. That's 14.5 degrees. And together they will form actually a compound 90-degree angle. So we're all set there. One thing I noticed early on was that this chestnut is awfully dark, and it's difficult to see my scribe lines and my pencil lines as I lay these out. So what I did was I went and I got some clear pine. Here it is here. And we're going to be making another tote, an identical tote to the one I'm making out of chestnut. And I'll be making all my scribe lines and mark lines on the pine so you can see what I'm doing. And then I'll be doing the same thing with the chestnut. So that means that you'll get a better look at what's going on here, and I'll wind up with a second tote. So guess who's getting that for Christmas? Anyway, first step is to get our base lines scribed. Typically when you scribe your base lines for dovetails, you simply take your marking gauge and set it at the depth you need, and then just scribe all the way around your board, like that. But it gets a little bit tricky when you've got a bevel, because you've got to ride that bevel and tilt it up on an angle like that. Now you can do it, but I thought it would be a lot simpler simply to trace those lines and scribe them using my bevel gauge that is already set. So I can scribe it like that. And you can see I've already done that. And then for my bevel here, it gets a little bit trickier. Now here is the bevel gauge set at 14.5 degrees. And for it to register correctly, I have to reference the angle on the end of the board. You see how I'm holding that? Now when I go to transfer that angle onto the edge of this board, I'm moving it off of that reference. I'm changing it. And that imparts a little bit of inaccuracy. So what I do is I held this at the proper angle, referencing this angle here, and then I simply used my mechanical pencil and very carefully projected that line onto the edge of this board. Now I didn't actually do it here, but then I used that pencil line and I copied it onto another bevel gauge, and that becomes my adjusted bevel gauge. And you can see up here I've made my marks referencing that bevel gauge there. And you need to do that, otherwise you'll be just putting a slight amount of error in what you're doing. So that discrepancy now has been taken care of, and I'm going to go ahead and mark the rest of these boards, and then we'll pick it up from there. Okay, I've got my base lines scribed, but before I lay out my tails, there's one other mark I need to make, and that's because these corners, top and bottom, have to be planed down. so that the top and bottom edges are parallel with a horizontal surface. And I can best show you that with this right here. This has to be 30 degrees from vertical, but then again I have to compensate and come up with an adjusted bevel gauge, because I need to reference the end of this board, which has its own angle and its own bevel on it, and I use that to mark those bevels, top and bottom here. See them? Mm-hmm. Now there is one problem with that, and that is because the end board, this one, is thicker than the side board. This is 5/8 of an inch and this is 3/8 of an inch. So I think I can best illustrate the difference here with these sample boards. This one is thicker and this one is thinner, and I've put the bevels on them to allow for that angle. Well, when you line them up, even though they're exactly the same width, there's a discrepancy down here. You see that? Mm-hmm. And that's because this angle here can extend further because the board is thicker, and they won't line up. So I have to remove more material from the thinner board so that they line up exactly. And that's what I've done already on these boards. I'll show you. I can't get these lined up just so. You'll see down here I've removed a little bit more from the thinner board, and these line up exactly. And that means that my tail spacing is going to be just how I want it. So now what I'm going to do is lay out the tail spacing, and you've probably seen me do this before. I like to use dividers, and if you need to see this in more detail, just click on the link below and you'll see. I'm just going to go ahead and do it here. I don't know how much of that you can see, but we'll go. I'm going to mark it again. Okay. And now, finally, I can mark my dovetails. Now I chose 1 6 as my dovetail slope, and I have a 1 6 dovetail marker. You can see it here, but it's really only for boards that have a square end on it. For boards that have an angle, like ours do, it doesn't work because it puts all the angles off to one side. So I need to use a bevel gauge to do my marks, and I have this here to help me set my bevel gauge. Let me show you what I have here. I've made a line straight down the middle, and it's parallel with the edges, and I've measured it 6 inches down, and then I made a line square to that and moved it 1 inch over. So I've got 6 inches down, 1 inch over, and then I connected these 2 points to create a 1 6 slope. And then over here I did the same thing. I measured over 1 inch, and this gives me a 1 6 inch slope going the other way. And this is what I use to set my angle. Let me swing this around here and I'll show you. There's the first angle on the one side of my dovetail. And I use this to mark my board. It's my tail board, and there are the slopes for the one side of my dovetail. But I can't flip this over to mark the other slope. I have to reset this. And in this case, I have another one ready to go to show you. And I reset this to the other slope angle over here. And I use this to mark the other slope of my dovetail along here. Now I can show you on the other side what you wind up with. Those are my tails there, and we're set to go. All I have to do is mark my other tail boards, and then we can start sawing. Okay, I've got my tails laid out and marked, and that's the most difficult part about compound dovetails, is the laying out and marking. I think the sawing and chopping is actually a little bit easier. So let me show you what we have here. I've got my tail board sandwiched in the vise, and I have it sandwiched with one of my end boards, and that's just to stiffen it up a little bit so I don't have any chatter. I also have a little work light here, so I can see my lines along the back here as I saw. I'm going to be using my back saw to cut the tails, and then I'm going to be using my fret saw to remove the waste between the tails. So if we're ready, let's get started here. Be as careful as I can. Now, transferring the tails to the pins. That's normally quite simple with dovetails. You just lay the tail board on the end grain of your pin board and trace away with your marking knife. But of course, with compound dovetails, it's never simple. So it gets a little bit tricky because of the compound angles and also the rather severe angles of the dovetails. Difficult to mark. So I've been meaning to try a new method that I heard about. It's using blue tape. You take a piece of blue tape and you put it along the end of your pin board and you carefully cut it off with an X-Acto blade. And then you set that in your vise here. And then I prop my pin board up against it like that, and I've got a little wooden box here to position it so that it doesn't rock. And that's good and solid there. Let me just get my marks lined up very quickly. Make sure it's just so. Okay, then I take my impeccably sharp X-Acto and trace my tails right onto that blue tape. Let's see how we do here. Get one shot at it here. Okay, now I just very gently remove the blue tape. Oops, I must remove the wrong blue tape. I need to remove the tail portion, that's right here. Don't you dare. Okay, look at that. Now, all I need to do is extend my lines down to my baseline here, and I can use my bevel gauge to do that, make them parallel with these edges. And then I can just saw using the blue tape as my guide, and it works really well. And after all of that sawing and paring and chopping, it's assembly time. This is what I've been waiting for. If I can get it together. Come along. There we go. Okay. Don't want this to budge. Oh boy. Okay, well, a little more strategic pairing to get everything to close up nicely, but I am absolutely thrilled with how this turned out. Let me give you a 360 tour here. Can we do that? Am I going fast enough?
Yep.
So a couple gaps here and there and things, but all in all, considering the difficulty level, it's the best I can do, I can say that. So I'm absolutely thrilled. There it is. So that's it for this episode. When we come back in show number 3, what we're going to be doing is planing these edges so that they're flat and straight and everything's nice. And then we have to work on getting that handle made. And that's going into mortises, I think. So that's going to be another challenge. And then, of course, the glue up and also putting in the bottom. So we're getting there. Thanks for stopping by, and see you next time.
Wasn't that great?